everyone, welcome to my channel Bibbity Bobbity Books. My name is Ellie and this is going to be my March reading wrap up. Firstly, I just want to apologise if my voice sounds a little bit weird. I have been quite poorly over the last week. I've caught this cold flu thing that's been going around and I've been really poorly for the last couple of days. I am coming out of the worst of it now. I'm kind of on the tail end of things, but I feel like I still sound a little bit congested, so I'm really sorry if that's annoying. But I really wanted to just carry on and film this video because I'm running out of time and I really want to get it up on my channel. So please forgive me if I sound a little bit weird and a little bit nasally. But yes, this is going to be a wrap up of all the books that I read in March. I read 5 books, which is about average for me because I am a fairly slow reader. And I've got quite a variety to talk to you about today, so I'm quite excited for it. So let's just jump in with the first book. Okay, so the first book that I read was actually a buddy read, and I read this one with my friend Christine over on the channel Secrets Reads. I'll have her channel linked down below so you can go and check out her content because she has some great videos over there. But yes, I read this one with her and we had an interesting reading experience, I would say. So we both read The Child Thief by Brom. And this was one of my most anticipated reads because I read Krampus by this author last year and I really enjoyed it. It actually made it onto my top 10 list from last year. So I had very high expectations for this one, especially because this is a Peter Pan retelling, a dark Peter Pan retelling, and I am a big fan of fairy tale retellings and I like Brom's writing and his artwork, which is also included in his stories. So I was really looking forward to this one, but unfortunately both Christine and I didn't have the best reading experience with this one. It definitely didn't quite work for both of us. Yeah, this is a dark Peter Pan retelling and it tells of Peter's birth and his really traumatic upbringing in his childhood and sort of the reason why he becomes the person that he is, and he becomes this child thief type character. And we also follow the perspective of a teen called Nick, who is one of the children that Peter rescues and he is running away from home because his home has been taken over by this gang of drug dealers, and he's trying to get away from all of that and he's running away, and Peter kind of helps him to escape and takes him to this land of fairies where it's supposed to be safer. But when Nick arrives he realizes that it's not so great and that he ends up kind of becoming unwittingly involved in this ongoing war that is happening. And this is so dark. Huge emphasis on the dark in here. Big trigger warnings for pretty much everything, so please do check those out if you are thinking of picking this one up. But yeah, I feel like it's quite an intricate story. I would say that Brom tries to weave together a lot of things in this book because obviously you've got the Peter Pan fairy tale retelling element, but he also weaves in some Celtic mythology. There's some Arthurian legend in here because Neverland in this story is basically is called Avalon. And Avalon is ruled over by this horned king and also the Lady of the Lake. So there's some really interesting crossover of myths and fairy tales in this story. But he also weaves in historical events as well, namely the colonization of America and also the spread of Christianity. So there's a lot going on within this story and I do feel a little bit like Brom bit off a little bit more than he could chew because there was just a lot thrown in the mix with this one, and I just feel like it was a bit too much and I feel like it would have been nicer to have stripped it back a little bit so that we could delve a little bit deeper into each of those things, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think the main reason why I personally didn't get on with this one is because of the characters. None of the characters in this book I found to be likeable, and I think that is on purpose. This is a very gritty and grim and dark story, and of course one of the main characters is Peter Pan, and he is very much a living contradiction because he is both simultaneously really unlikable and selfish and childlike, of course, but then he's also quite endearing, and he holds both of those things at once. He's both really quite evil but also really quite innocent at the same time, and because of that he's quite infuriating to follow, because he shows moments of insight and moments of likability, but then he will switch and he'll do things that are very, very dark. And I feel like that's actually quite in keeping with the original Peter Pan story, because Peter is a very complex character, and the fact that he is a child forever also has a big impact on him as a character as well. And I feel like, again, that makes it difficult for us to root for him, because in this story he's actually very old but he is still a child, and I think because of that his viewpoint never really matures, so he never really has much of a character development. He stays kind of the same throughout the whole book, and for that reason I found it difficult to root for him. I will say the perspective of Nick is a little bit more interesting. He has a little bit more nuance to him. I don't know if nuance is the right word, but he has a little bit more going for him in terms of making you want to be on his side, but he still reads a little bit annoying. And again, I think that's because he's a teenage character and he's had a very traumatic past, and because of that, of course, he's going to be quite difficult, quite challenging, quite childlike, I guess. And then of course we have the Lost Boys, and they are all, again, not likable. They're all bullies, really. They all bully each other and it's a little bit much. And even the Fae characters in this story, such as the Lady of the Lake and things like that, they are all very selfish and they are all caught up in this ongoing feud. And so none of the characters in here are likable. I found myself not really caring about any of them because of that, which sounds awful, but it's the truth. And also I feel like this book is very dark, so it's basically dark scene after dark scene after dark scene, and I found myself becoming a little bit desensitized to it because of that, because it is just so heavy, so dark, constantly. There is no relief from it, and so by the end I just kind of almost felt a little bit desensitized. And my other issue, I would say, would be the pacing of this story, because there were moments where I felt like things were a little bit too rushed and that it didn't have the impact that it should have had, because we kind of breeze over some of these really horrific scenes. And then there are other times where it dragged, particularly at the end. There's this big battle scene that happens and it just goes on forever. And there's also some pages of info dump and things like that. So yeah, a little bit of pacing issues for me as well. So yeah, this book had a lot of things that I should have loved. Namely, it's a dark fairy tale retelling, it has complex characters, it weaves in myth and folklore, lots of things that should have worked for me, and unfortunately it just didn't this time. The other thing I want to mention as well, actually quickly before I move on, is that it has a lot of vulgar language in it as well, which was just a little bit much. Again, a lot of these are children in this story and they are talking like with real foul language, and that doesn't normally bother me, but it's just very overdone, I feel, in this book, and it just felt a little bit off-putting. So please be warned of that as well before you go into this one. But yeah, this book has had a lot of high praises, so I do just think it's one that just didn't click for me, didn't quite work. But if you want to try it out, do go ahead and read some reviews. Please don't let me put you off, because I know a lot of people do think that this is really good. But yeah, it just wasn't one for me, unfortunately. But I will be continuing to read this author's work because I am intrigued by their works. I like some of their concept and ideas, I quite like their writing style, and I love their artwork. So I will be reading more from this author, and hopefully I'll have a bit of a better time then with this one. Okay, in complete opposite to The Child Thief, the next book that I read was Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldree. This is, of course, the prequel to Legends and Lattes, which is the cosy fantasy that took the world by storm when it was first published. And this was such a delight. I loved this one. It's a cosy, low-stakes fantasy. I feel like I enjoyed this one even more than Legends and Lattes, but it was a while ago since I read that one. so I'm not 100% sure, but I just really enjoyed this one. I thought it was so charming. So this is a story that follows Viv, who is the character we also follow in Legends and Lattes. She is an orc barbarian, and in this story she is injured during a battle. She's basically trying to hunt down this evil necromancer, and she ends up getting wounded and has to go and rest up in a beachside town. A very sleepy beachside town, and she's not very happy about it because she is wanting to get in with the action, and she's not pleased about the fact that she's having to take a break because of her leg, which is injured. But she ends up kind of exploring the town, and she finds this little bookshop and makes friends with the owner, and she discovers a new love of books, which is just so fun. The bookshop owner is this little like mouse person who has a really foul mouth, which is quite funny, and her bookshop isn't doing very well, so Viv decides to try and help her fix it up a little bit, and she becomes really close friends with this little shop owner, and she also has a little bit of a summer fling with a dwarf baker who lives next door, so that's very sweet and charming. And yeah, it's a cozy, low-stakes fantasy, but there is also that looming threat of the necromancer as well, which is very much present in this book. So I feel like it has just enough threat, just enough plot to keep me hooked. It's not completely slice of life. We still have, you know, some conflict going on, and I just loved it. I love the characters, I loved the focus on reading and books and the love of reading, and there's also a character in here who is a skeleton who basically lives in a satchel. His name is Satchel because of it, and he spends most of his time as a bag of bones, but then you can animate him by sprinkling on some bone dust and he becomes this animated skeleton character, and he's so funny and I just love that. So yeah, this has some really fun ideas, a really quaint world, lovable characters, and it was the perfect light relief following The Child Thief. So yeah, if you're looking for something cozy, I definitely recommend this book. Okay, so the next book that I read was actually a young adult horror novel, and this is possibly one of the most addictive books that I've read in a while. This is called When Ghosts Call Us Home, and it's written by Katja de Becerra. It was so fun. I raced through this one. So if you are a fan of young adult horror and if you're looking for something to bring you out of a reading slump, I would definitely recommend this one because it is such a page turner and I just ate it up. I'm going to read you the tagline actually because I feel like it sums it up really well. So the tagline for this is: "The haunting of Hill House meets found footage horror in this edge of your seat thriller that explores the power of family ties and the trauma that lurks there." So yeah, I feel like that kind of sums it up really. This follows our main character Sophia, who starred in her sister's horror movie, this amateur horror movie, when she was 12 years old, and this sort of horror movie became really successful and it had this really big cult following, and then years later her older sister, the one who filmed and directed this movie, ended up going missing, and our main character Sophia is trying to find out what happened to her, and she's trying to follow these clues that her sister left her, and they all lead her back to the house where they filmed this horror movie. It's this house on the coast, and Sophia, our main character, ends up deciding to film this documentary about the movie that she starred in when she was 12 because it's going to be filmed at that location. So it's kind of an excuse for her to get back into this home where her sister filmed this movie those years ago, and so she can kind of figure out what's going on. And the documentary that they're filming actually includes refilming some of the famous scenes from this movie, and you can kind of get the idea really. It's just so fun. It's very kind of on the edge of your seat, very gripping, and I enjoyed it. The only thing I would say is that I found not everything completely tied together at the end. I wasn't 100% sure how it all fitted together. You definitely have to suspend your disbelief with this one as well, because you don't necessarily get all your answers and it is a little bit unrealistic. But if you're willing to just put that aside and have a fun time, then I think you will really enjoy this one. I will also say that there is a romance in here, and I personally didn't enjoy that. I easily could have done without the romance, and I feel like it was kind of crowbarred in there just because this is a young adult novel, and sometimes I feel like authors feel they need to include romance for a young adult audience because that's what they enjoy, and I just don't think that's necessarily the case. And I feel like it was just a little bit cheesy in here and just didn't really add anything to the plot at all, and just was kind of a bit like, oh, why are we including this? So yeah, the romance didn't really work for me, but I could easily just brush past that and not focus on it. And the only other thing that I just wish was explored a little bit more in detail in this book was the sister dynamic, because the sisters had such an interesting relationship, because the older sister very much manipulated Sophia when she was 12 for the sake of her art. So basically she put Sophia in these really frightening situations so that she could film her real reactions. And so there's this really weird power dynamic between the two sisters, and I just feel like that's such an interesting thing to dissect, and I wish that they looked into that a bit more in this book, but that's just a personal preference. But basically, if you're looking for a fun time, a thriller with horror vibes, if you're a fan of like horror movies, that kind of thing, then I would definitely recommend this one, especially if you're in a bit of a slump, because my goodness, I raced through this one. Okay, and the next book that I read was A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. This was a reread for me, and I read this one with my husband. We both read it on audio. We listened to the graphic audio production of it, which you can get on Audible. And the reason for that was because my husband and I were supposed to be going to this ACOTAR themed ball. Unfortunately, the ball ended up getting cancelled, but I wanted my husband to read the story so that he knew kind of what was going on. He could recognise the characters and things, because obviously we were planning to go to this event, and I felt like it would be weird if he went and didn't know anything about the books. So I encouraged him to read it for the first time, and it was a really fun experience. And I actually filmed a vlog, so if you want to hear his thoughts and also my thoughts in a little bit more depth as well, then I will link that vlog down below. But yeah, so we both listened to this one, and A Court of Thorns and Roses is a series that I read quite a few years ago. It's actually the series that got me back into reading, because I just hadn't really, I'd fallen out of love with reading, I suppose. I did a lot of reading for my studies and things like that, and then I wanted a break from it. And then sort of the pandemic hit, and I just picked those books up on a whim and ended up just eating them up and became like addicted to them. It was just what I needed at the time, that just kind of pure escapism. And so it was really fun being back in that world, although it was a little bit strange going back and re-listening to it, because I feel like my tastes have changed a lot since I read this series. And also, I don't know, listening to it with my husband was a little bit strange. And also the audio experience is very different, I feel, to reading it physically. I'm very fussy with audiobooks and narrators, and unfortunately the narrator that performed as Feyre in this version didn't really work for me. Her voice is very breathy, she sounds very young, which I feel like is very appropriate for the book, because Feyre is very young, but for me it just kind of grated on me a little bit. It didn't quite work, but I still had a fun time being back in this world, and it was very strange going back to the first book and reminding myself about the characters and where they were in the beginning of this series. I've just realised I haven't told you what this series is about. I'm so sorry. I feel like it's been out for a while, so you've probably heard of it already, but essentially the first book in this trilogy is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and we follow our main character Feyre, who is a young woman, and she has had to fend for herself a little bit. Her family were once wealthy, but they lost a lot of their wealth and they became peasants essentially, and she's had to learn how to hunt for food to keep her family alive. And then one day she shoots this wolf, and it turns out the wolf was actually a fae, and this fae lord, this man called Tamlin, this fae called Tamlin, turns up at her door and demands payment basically for the fact that she killed one of his kind, and in payment he decides to take her to the spring court as kind of like payment, I guess, a life for a life, I suppose. So she moves into the spring court with Tamlin, and then things go on from there. It's a fantasy romance. It does go off on a bit of a journey. It does have quite a dark turn to it, which I quite appreciate, but it's a fun time. It has, you know, a feisty female main character, it has trials in it, it has fae, it's set in the spring court, a lot of it, so it has lots of like beautiful descriptions of the spring countryside and things. I feel like it was a good book to pick up this time of year. But yeah, it has a lot of tropes, it has a huge fan base, and it was just a fun time being back in that world, although I will say there is some questionable triggers in there and things as well, so do check out trigger warnings and things, because Feyre, bless her, goes through a lot in that first book. Anyway, the final book that I read in March was The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. So this is the first book in the Broken Earth trilogy. This is a very highly acclaimed series. You can see on the front there, this one won a Hugo Award. In fact, I think every book in this trilogy has won a Hugo Award, which is just crazy. So yeah, it's a very highly praised series, so I'm very excited to finally be getting into this one, and I can confirm I did really enjoy this first instalment. So this is a adult series, and it's set on a world called Earth. It's not clear if that is our Earth or if it's like an alternate reality, but it's basically in the far-flung future, I believe, and on this Earth there is a big continent called the Stillness, and the Stillness is ravaged by these storms and these cataclysmic events that happen periodically throughout history, and each time one of these cataclysmic events happens, it's called a season, and it basically destroys the whole Earth. So on this planet there is a civilization that has had to try and survive these seasons and to build up literally from the rubble each time one of these seasons happens, if you're lucky enough to survive one of them. And so it's really interesting. It's kind of like an apocalyptic style story, quite a gritty setting, and of course you've got these people who are trying to navigate and to live and survive on this very volatile, very dangerous world. And in this world there are humans, but there are also humans that have particular gifts, and they are an oppressed people called origins, and they have the ability to sense and manipulate the earth. So they can do things like they can quell tremors, and they can, you know, move rock and things like that. They can basically manipulate the earth, and of course in this setting that's a very useful skill to have, but these people are heavily oppressed because they are very dangerous, and because if they don't have good enough control over their powers, they can have you know, devastating effects. They can accidentally kill people, they can accidentally set off volcanoes, and so the humans that don't have those powers keep them very much under their control. And it's really interesting seeing how these origins are used within this society, and there's definitely a lot of themes of oppression, of hierarchy, of power and of control in this book. And there are also a lot of trigger warnings, particularly for things like child abuse, so please just do be warned of that going in. But yeah, in this first book we follow 3 perspectives, and the interesting thing about this book is that one of the perspectives is actually in second person, which is something that I think is either going to make it or break it for you. For me, I found that those chapters were a little bit difficult to get into. I wasn't sure at first if I was going to gel with it, because it's told literally like you do this and you do that. And when it says you, it doesn't mean you, the reader. It's very clear that that perspective is a character within this world, but it's being talked about by someone else. So someone else is saying, you did this and blah, blah, blah. And it's just a very strange perspective to read from, but your brain kind of gets used to it, or at least mine did anyway, and there's definitely a reason for it, and there are clues throughout the narrative to point the reader towards why that narrative is told in that particular way. And it's really interesting kind of piecing it together and figuring out what's going on and how all of these three perspectives tie together. And yeah, it's really page turning. Again, I feel like this one was a good one to pick up because it kept me intrigued. I will say, if you're a plot driven reader, you might not necessarily get on with this one because not much actually happens. You basically spend the whole time walking alongside your characters, getting to know them and getting to know the world. But I think because you're flicking between the three perspectives and because you're constantly trying to figure out what's going on with the world and what's going on with these characters, it does keep you engaged, or at least it kept me engaged anyway. And it's such an interesting world to explore and some really interesting characters as well. I'll definitely say that this is character driven. So yeah, I had a really fun time with this one, and I'm definitely excited to get to the next few books. I feel like this was definitely a lot of setup, so I'm very excited to see where we go from here now that we have established the world and things like that in this book. So yeah, I am very excited to continue on with this one, and I'm excited to have finally picked it up. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this wrap up. Those were the books that I read in March. I really hope that you enjoyed hearing my thoughts and opinions on them. Please let me know if you've read any of those books before and what your thoughts were, because I'd love to have a chat with you down in the comments section. And let me know what you're planning to pick up soon. Are there any books that you've read recently that you think that I would enjoy? I'm always on the hunt for recommendations, so please do chat with me in the comment section down below. Don't forget to like this video if you did like it, subscribe if you want to see some more from me, and I guess I'll see you next time with another video. Bye!